years writing not just about the loss of Carlton and how that affected our family, in effect, putting a face on 9/11 for readers, but also exploring the roots of violence-prone religious fanaticism. What I'm about to share with you will be a distillation of one chapter in my next book. It's a book about all of this subject, and it will be published next year. We Americans, not surprisingly, tend to see our lives through America-centric eyes. When we talk about racism and the zealots who preach it, for instance, generally we're referring to the idea of white supremacy that shaped our nation's founding, as well as to the history of slavery in the US, to our Civil War, to Reconstruction, to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, to the Jim Crow era, and finally to the Civil Rights Movement and later efforts to combat the worst of all of that, including the Black Lives Matter movement of today. But in fact, barbarous bigotry that is fertilized by fear and ignorance is a global problem. The question is whether any nation or group of people can take the lead in finding ways to defang extremism and prejudicial thinking, whether based in religion or something else, and to help people live, if not in total harmony, at least without the kind of wretched violence that has smashed into my family and so many others. So I'm going to offer you a few suggestions for nonviolent ways to live in relative peace with people who may have radically different ideas from us. And the first one I am giving you, you almost certainly will roll your eyes. It is respect and love for others. Simple, right? Well, in my Christian tradition, one of the most difficult tasks we are given is not just to treat others with respect, but to love them, which means always having their best interests at heart. But on what basis do we do that? Well, one answer is that Scripture tells us that all people are created in the image of God. And one way we Christians think about that, and about the Imago Dei, as we call it, the image of God, being in everyone, is to say that we are obliged to see Christ in every human being, Christian or not. And having recognized Christ in another, the last thing we should want to do is to insult, injure, or murder the person indwelled by Christ. In contrast to the beliefs that led to 9/11 and to other massacres, think of this as the counter-narrative of love. When author Glenn Tinder considers the idea of each of us being created by love in God's image, which he calls the principle of the exalted individual, he says that idea is the spiritual center of Western politics. Because of that idea, we have a welfare system, not a very good one, but we have one. Because of that idea, we send the Coast Guard out to rescue just one hapless sailor in trouble. Because of that idea, our Constitution contains a Bill of Rights. And Tinder writes this: although the principle is often forgotten and often grossly violated, were it erased from our minds and our politics, it would probably become altogether what it is at present only in part, an affair of expediency and self-interest. Other faith traditions have other ways of thinking about the precious nature of each human being, and so followers of those traditions obviously should be familiar with such teachings and try to live accordingly. If the world were perfect, of course, and the biblical witness is that God created it and declared it good, not perfect, everyone would live according to this standard of respect and love, meaning human violence against others would end, would in fact be unthinkable. But because it's not perfect, we need more tools. The second tool in this kit is this: become more religiously literate. Our human tendency is to fear what we don't know or understand. To break that habit, it's necessary to commit ourselves to learning about religious traditions and philosophical worldviews beyond our own. So thank goodness for places like the Interfaith Institute at Miami University. There are many ways to accomplish this task. One is to read some helpful books. I'd start with Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't, by Stephen Prothero. Then I would add some books that cover broadly world religions. Perhaps begin with one by the great and now late Houston Smith, The Illustrated World's Religions, a guide to our wisdom traditions. Though you won't go wrong with any book on any world religion by Smith. Also consider this book, World Religions in America. Jacob Neusner is the editor. To grasp in more detail why becoming religiously literate is necessary, read Barbara Brown Taylor's latest book called Holy Envy, Finding God in the Faith of Others. The idea is not to abandon our own faith tradition in favor of one you discover in your reading. Rather, it's to deepen your understanding of your religion by seeing how it compares and contrasts to others. As Taylor's book shows, it is possible to find things in other traditions that are attractive and worthy not just of respect, but also of incorporating into your own spiritual life, such as Islam's discipline of daily prayer, or Judaism's focus on welcoming strangers and on atonement for wrongs, and on starting fresh again, or on Buddhism's emphasis on mindfulness. Next, I would suggest we find sources that will help you understand specific religious traditions about which you may be ignorant. If, for instance, you want to know about Islam, I recommend starting with this book. It's called The Heart of Islam, Enduring Values for Humanity by Syed Hossein Nasser. Specifically for Christians trying to understand Islam, I recommend the book called Allah, A Christian Response by Miroslav Volf, which contains a brilliant chapter on the Holy Trinity and how Trinitarianism relates to Islam's, humanity's, and Judaism's insistent monotheism. For a basic but helpful introduction to Judaism, try a book called Accessible Judaism, a concise guide by my friend Rabbi Jacques Kukierkorn, with whom I wrote a book about the Holocaust. Number 3 on my list is to get outside your comfortable religious and worldview surroundings. You can do that in several ways, the most obvious being travel. Now, if you can't afford to go to India, say to experience Hinduism firsthand, perhaps you can go to a Hindu temple near you. Such temples are increasingly found across the US. Or to see a particular expression of Catholicism that may be quite different from what you know, go to Mexico for its annual Day of the Dead celebration. To learn what an American version of Islam looks like in a metropolitan area where Muslims are numerous, visit a mosque in the Detroit area. I have found the Islamic Center of America in Dearborn and the Islamic Institute of America, also in Dearborn, to be quite welcoming to non-Muslims. You can also find ways to visit sacred structures in your own community. Often, such tours are available through local colleges and universities and through other agencies that focus on keeping the fabric of religion strong. In my own Kansas City area, for instance, there's an organization called Friends of Sacred Structures, and it not only helps congregations preserve and protect their property, but also at times has offered tours for people who want a better idea of what faith communities are active in the local area and what the sacred space looks like. Every time you experience a religious tradition other than your own, you gain not only knowledge, but also the idea that people very much like yourself have made other religious choices that do not threaten the safety and peace of their neighbors. That, of course, means that you don't feel a need to exterminate them or push them out of town. Just go see how others live out a religion in different ways, and you almost certainly will feel less anxious about them and will be less willing to denigrate them. As I say, exposure to other faith traditions often results in a deeper commitment to your own tradition. Number 4 on my list is this: engage in interfaith dialogue and cooperation. And that's sort of what we're doing today. Many communities have faith or interfaith organizations that promote understanding. In my Kansas City region, for instance, there's the Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council. The idea is not to work for the mashing together of different religions into one broad syncretistic mess of religion. Rather, the idea is for people of different faith traditions to know and to be known. It's to understand that many different approaches to religion, that there are many different approaches that people of goodwill adopt, an understanding that should lead us to a bit of humility about whether our own choice about God's direction is aimed also at everyone else. And even if we think those directions are for everyone else, that doesn't mean and it doesn't obligate us to attack or do away with people who don't agree with us. Proselytizing need not be violent or even disrespectful. Also look for interfaith efforts across the US aimed at education and not conversion. There are even seminaries, especially Hartford Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut, that offer various kinds of interfaith experiences and degrees. One example of an international organization that promotes interfaith discourse is the Dialogue Institute, which is connected with the Gulen movement in Turkey, named after a Muslim cleric, Fethullah Gulen, who now lives in exile in the US. The branch of that organization in the Kansas City area sponsors an annual interfaith dinner, food festivals, speakers, and other approaches to give non-Muslims a chance to learn more about Islam and to give Muslims, particularly though not exclusively those with Turkish roots, a chance to create friendly relations with people of other faith traditions. Another example of a long-standing interfaith work in the US is the Pluralism Project based at Harvard University. It and other organizations are responding to the shifting landscape in the US, and that's a demographic phenomenon that you can keep track of through the Pew Research Center's Religious Landscape Study. It pretty regularly updates the picture of what religion in America looks like. And knowing that the US population no longer reflects quite the landslide for Christianity that has been the case throughout much of the nation's history, should drive us to want to know more about America's religious makeup and what we can do to create an atmosphere in which there is much more harmony than turmoil, much more respect than hatred. Especially important in this area is to get to know people of different faith traditions in personal ways. Be guests in each other's homes, particularly after we get past this pandemic. Eat meals together, visit their congregations and invite them to visit yours if you have one. Tell them your story and ask to hear their story. Stories plural, in fact. In other words, make friends with people who are different from you. Learn from them, teach them. You might learn something and so might they. Number 5 on my list is this: teach your children and grandchildren well. Specific hatreds must be taught. And children will learn hatred from some of the people around them if they are not taught respect, love, and compassion. And sadly, they will learn that sometimes even if they are taught that. At the very least, they must learn tolerance, which is a terrifically low standard, but at least it is to be preferred over contempt, which always leaves the door open for violence. For young children, a good place to start is with 3 charming illustrated books by my friend Amy Jill Levine, the great New Testament scholar from Vanderbilt, and Sandy Eisenberg, Sasso. Their books are called Who is My Neighbor?, The Marvelous Mustard Seed, and Who Counts? 100 Sheep, 10 Coins, and 2 Sons. These books are modern retellings of some of the proverbs of Jesus. And they open up children to the vital idea that each human is precious. Good librarians, whether in public libraries or in congregations, can guide you toward works of literature, art, film, and music that can reinforce the idea that violence in support of barbaric theological ideas should be anathema, always and everywhere. As children enter their teens, there are many opportunities to expose them not just to deeper details of their religious traditions or those of their parents or grandparents, but also to traditions of others. In Kansas City, some of that work in recent years has happened through both the Kansas City Interfaith Youth Council, on the board of which I have served, the Faith Always Wins Foundation, which has engaged youth in many ways. Through workshops, readings, speakers, and service projects, teens come to appreciate the gift of religious pluralism, even as they find deeper meaning in their own religious tradition or worldview. The Interfaith Youth Alliance here is patterned after the Interfaith Youth Corps based in Chicago and founded there by the terrific interfaith youth leader and author Eboo Patel, whose guidance was instrumental in creating the Kansas City group. Another Kansas City nonprofit that works in this area is the Center for Religious Experience and Study, or CRESS, whose founder is with us today, Vern Barnett, that promotes understanding of all faith traditions. So see if there's some similar organization near wherever you are. Number 6 on my list is to deepen your knowledge of both American and world history. A fair amount of global terrorism is tied to the shockwaves that have radiated across the nation and around the globe from historical events about which many people, especially many Americans, seem to be ignorant, seem to know little or nothing. That's particularly true about geopolitical and religious history in the Third World, including parts of the Middle East. Why, for instance, have Iranians been angry with America? Well, did you know, as many of you, of course, did, that in 1953, the US government orchestrated a coup to overthrow the legitimately elected government of Iran and replace it with a rule by the man who turned out to be the last Shah of Iran, the grossly corrupt Mohammad Reza Pahlavi? Are you aware that the United States was among the first governments to formally recognize the modern nation of Israel when it was created in 1948? That was an act that I think was the right thing to do, but let's recognize that it infuriated many Palestinians and more broadly, many Arabs. Do you know about the efforts of the American government to encourage the overthrow of President Salvador Allende of Chile in 1973? Or about the US intelligence agency's role in the 1961 Bay of Pigs failed invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro? The list is of problematic and even sometimes, if defensible, actions taken by the US over its history is long indeed. Although all of the ones I just mentioned have occurred in my own lifetime. And I haven't even mentioned the unjust war in Vietnam. Despite all of the great work here and around the world that the US has done across its history, In modern times, starting with the post-World War II Marshall Plan, the role America played in the creation of the UN and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the US has made many enemies, some of whom have chosen to use acts of terrorism to right what they consider to be wrongs. I am not suggesting we forgive acts of terrorism or that we consider America's foreign policy across its history simply one disaster after another. That would be both wrong and unfair. But it's important to know that both America and world history, to be able to understand what sometimes motivates America's declared enemies, especially those who justify their violent acts of defiance and retribution by using religious language. If America's military leaders, including whoever is commander-in-chief, sometimes seem to draft God into their various branches, why are we surprised when other governments and non-government forces do the same? And while you're studying history, make sure you have several reliable news sources available so you can grasp what is happening around you today, events that eventually will make it into the history books. Do not rely on just one source. If you do, you will not have a clear picture of what's happening and why. Don't put yourself in a news silo or echo chamber. And for God's sakes, learn the difference between news articles and editorials or opinion columns. As an opinion columnist, I am sometimes shocked when people complain that a column contained an opinion. As you become more aware of US and world history, it will also help to have some knowledge of how the US government gathers and uses intelligence to help protect its citizens. One place to start learning about that process is by visiting the Center for the Study of Intelligence on the CIA's own website. Various articles there can lead you to other scholars and authors who can help you understand when intelligence is done properly and when it may be in possible violation of the constitutional rights of us citizens. Good intelligence can save lives and thwart the kind of deadly action we saw on 9/11. But the danger is that the nation might become what's been called a national security state. I'm getting toward the end of my list here, but number 7 is this. In this remarkably divisive time in our nation, become competent in civil discourse. The practice of civility can help to teach us how to listen carefully, how to appreciate points of view that are not our own. That in turn can lead us away from any tendency to align ourselves with people who imagine they know all the answers and are unwilling to entertain other ideas. The first thing to do to improve your ability to participate in civil discourse is to recognize that you will not find many models for that today on talk radio stations. The Rush Limbaughs, Howard Sterns, Michael Savages, and Alex Joneses have been among the problems, not the solutions. And the same can be said for President Trump and his tweet storms. But you can get some helpful advice from several books on this topic. And let me just mention a couple of them. One is by Rabbi Brad Hirschfield. It's called You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right. Another book to add to your list is The Case for Civility and Why Our Future Depends on It by Os Guinness. Another good choice is a book called In Defense of Civility, How Religion Can Unite America on 7 Moral Issues That Divide Us. It's by James Calvin Davis. Davis and Guinness's book echo Tinder's emphasis on the need to respect the exalted individual. And the same is true in another book I recommend. It's called Uncommon Decency, Christian Civility in an Uncivil World by Richard Mao. Just participating in interfaith dialogue, by the way, does not mean abandoning our religious beliefs and traditions. So engaging in civil discourse does not mean giving up our opinions. Although if we're open to learning, sometimes it might actually mean that. Number 8, and my final one on my list, is this: spend time with people who have experienced profound guilt. Profound grief. That is the emotional equivalent of walking a mile in someone else's shoes. It can open our eyes to the countless ways that death, particularly unexpected, violent death, can affect almost every aspect of lives of survivors. You may not know anyone personally who has lost family members on 9/11, although now you do, or in other terrorist attacks. But there are lots of surviving family members of those who died in attacks in El Paso and Pittsburgh and Poway and Charleston, Kansas City, and on and on. If there's an opportunity, meet some of them. Talk with them if they're willing to do that, but only if they're willing. Let them tell you their story. Something like that experience also is available with families of people who died by suicide, or in car accidents, or in airline crashes not caused by terrorism. Seek them out, not so you can intrude on their lives in inappropriate ways or ghoulishly make them tell you about death and grief, but so that you can offer them deep wells of compassion from which to draw comfort. And so that in the end, you can learn not just sympathy, but empathy, and also learn how to avoid offering them stupid cliches. At the very least, go to funerals of people whose families you know, even of people who died of old age or of some illness late in life. Be present, hear their stories. Recognize that grief is not a limited engagement 2-week downer, but an emotional experience that lasts and lasts, even as sorrow usually but slowly becomes easier to bear. This will help you understand at least a little of what bereavement is like for people whose family members have died because of diseased religious thinking or bigotry of some other kind. And maybe it will make you want to find ways to unplug such lunacy. As you do that, however, it's important to acknowledge that it is impossible to reason with irrationality. Just don't decide too soon that it's really irrationality against which you're contending. You will know soon enough. So I'm going to stop there, and I will be happy to respond to your questions and comments, and urge you when we get done to go and be part of the solution here. Geneva, I'm going to give it back to you, and you can guide us for how we go forward from here.
Thank you so much, Bill. So I'm just going to open the floor. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? You can unmute yourself.
I would. Hi, it's Rabbi Kukierkorn, although my thing it says Comunidad Braja, Mexico. And first of all, I'm glad to be here. I think Vern is looking very prophetic, and Bill was terrific as always. I appreciate the plug to my book. But Bill, once you are convinced of everything you're telling us, what is your role? What should be the role? What should be the limits of speaking up against bigotry and racism? I mean, to what extent should you speak up? That's it.
Thank you, Jacques. I'm not sure that there is a limit to that. That is, it seems to me that any time you find this kind of bigotry, this kind of extremism, it's incumbent to say something. Now, you have to choose your your way of doing that. If every time you go,
Zoom meeting.
something that you dislike, you run out on the street with a megaphone, eventually that becomes not a very useful tool. But there are many tools you can use. You can use public social media. You can write letters to the editor of actual newspapers that are still published in print. You can be a public voice in groups that that you're part of. So there's almost no end of the way you can do it. And I think as long as you see something that is amiss, then it's your obligation to speak and not just give up because you're now 65 years old and you're done, or you're 85 years old and you're done, or you're 18 and you don't know anything. No, at any age, you need to challenge what you think is wrong, but listen to the one you're challenging in case you're wrong and there's something that you can learn from that challenge.
Bill, this is Vern. Thank you so much for, I think I counted 8 points. It occurs to me that some of the suggestions that you're making could also be adapted to our understanding our racial tensions a little better. Could you comment on, although many of your books and so forth are specifically about religious understanding, some of the processes that you suggest might aid in helping us move ahead as a nation into a better racial context.
Right. I agree with you, Vern. I think, for instance, one place to begin to look at in this time, in this post-George Floyd death time, to look at the history of white supremacy in America, to read books about that, to rediscover that in our very own founding documents, white supremacy is woven deeply into those documents. To be part of groups that are wrestling with this. At my own congregation, we are beginning to, well, we've done this for quite a long time actually, but we are doing a new focus on anti-racism training. There's one that was going on this afternoon that I was part of briefly before coming over here. And one of the things we learned from that is to, as a white male, at times is just shut up and listen, shut up and learn. And when we are in conversation with African Americans, for instance, we want to avoid being the people who insist that they teach us. You know, tell me what I'm doing wrong. We have to just back off, be quiet, and listen and learn. So, as I say, some of the books that I recommend in this anti-extremism ideas, that's a place to start, certainly in racism, anti-racist work, conversations on social media and so on. You're right, a lot of these proposals, I think, would translate into other areas. And in fact, as we know, racism leads to violence, and so we need to have to understand, those of us who are Christian need to understand how the Ku Klux Klan claims to be Christian and how parts of the churches justified slavery. So all of that history we need to know about. so that we're not operating out of complete ignorance.
Thank you, Bill. Does anyone else have any questions? You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to ask. Dorothy?
Yeah, I have the question that I put on the chat. Please help me understand how I can view Rush Limbaugh or Hitler or Trump as precious and how I can love them.
Hardest question of the day. The reality is all three of those people are human beings born to real live mothers. And we don't, when I say that as a Christian, I'm called to love these people, it doesn't mean I'm called to like them. It doesn't mean I'm called to agree with them. What it means is that I am called to recognize our common humanity, and that if there are ways that I can understand them better as human beings, I'm required to do that. That said, remember that I also said you cannot reason with irrationality. And so at some point, you simply have to walk away and say, I cannot convince a Hitler. I cannot convince a Rush Limbaugh, and I don't mean to equate the two of them, that they can't learn anything from me anymore. I'm wasting my breath. And so you move away from them and you spend your effort and time in a better place. But we also have to remember that the worst tyrants in the world were also human beings, and that we are capable of that kind of evil. There is in my religious tradition called the Reformed tradition of Christianity, which means the Presbyterians, basically. We have a doctrine called the total depravity of humankind. It sounds terrible, and it is, but it's not as bad as it sounds. All it is saying is that all of us are capable of sin and evil, and that the image of God within us is stained, and we can't rescue ourselves. We need help with that. So once we recognize that we ourselves are capable of evil, then it's a daily struggle to have, the good voice, our better angels trying to lead us. And at times we want to turn to the Trumps, the people you mentioned, and demand that their better angels lead them, and we should demand that. But we also have to have a little bit of humility about the fact that we are also capable of evil.
Are there any other questions?
I want you to know that one of the people on board here is my sister. You will see she's waving, Mary. And Mary, I would invite you, if you want to say anything you would like about how Carlton's death by terrorism affected you and our family. And if you don't want to, I won't hold it against you.
Well, our daughter was living in New York at the time. She was going to Columbia University. And she got a phone call from us at home saying, what's happening there? We saw it on the television and we called immediately, and she was just freaked out. She was living by herself and so on. And boy, there was just so many things that started happening. she needed some friends. Oh, the phone lines were down completely. And so we were communicating by text messaging through the computer. And I told her, go over to a friend's house, be with somebody. And she went downstairs and she didn't have any money. So she went to a cash machine and she got out a few dollars. And she went and found a cab to take her across town to her friends. And the cab driver would not accept any payment. And he gave her a rose as she got out of the car. And she was able to be with her friends for quite a while. And then she had two other friends from Chicago decide that they were going to go get her. And they drove overnight from Chicago to Washington. She was able to take a train to Washington. They picked her up there and brought her home. So I think, you know, she dives and cries every time the air and water show happens in Chicago, because those big planes come right down over your head. And she just has a lot of trouble with that. And she has a lot of, I mean, she misses her cousin tremendously. But we also found that there were such good helping people who gave us strength to go on and to face it. Our son got married the next weekend. And so we had a lot of support, family support from that as well. But it's still, you know, it's a hard thing to talk about because it tore one part of our family apart, and they've had trouble getting back together from that too, so.
It's interesting that Amanda, Mary's daughter that she was just talking about, has recently used social media in our current effort against racism and extremism in that way. Amanda is Japanese American. Mary's husband was born in one of the concentration camps in World War II, is Japanese American. And so Amanda recently posted 10 days worth of names that she has been called and the circumstances in which she was called those names, as a way of saying that racism affects not just African Americans, it affects other people of different minority groups and so on. And as a way of teaching us. And I thought it was a beautiful thing to do and quite helpful. And it struck a chord with someone close in my family who learned from it and should have learned from it. So thank you, Mary.
Welcome. Thank you.
I don't know if I could get on or not. Charlie Broomfield from Kansas City. Bill, I've followed your career in the Kansas City Star. I just made a note. I've been a subscriber to the Kansas City Star for 60 years.
Wow.
And, it's getting smaller every day. But I wanted to ask you the question. I've been studying this subject of extremism for quite some time now. I started out years ago to be a Baptist preacher. It didn't take me long to get over that, but
you got into politics.
Experience. I have a book that I'm studying right now entitled "Taking America Back for God: Nationalism in the United States." When I received the invitation to the program here, I quickly got excited about how to learn about dealing with the religious right, dominionist, the right-wing extremist. And I guess my question is, these people have taken over the United States government, and in about 110 days, they have a great opportunity to take it over again and probably eliminate democracy. You obviously are a very, very peaceful man, but I guess a part of my question, how do you deal with this? And shall we just sit still and watch it happen, or shall we respond in some way?
Well, Charlie, we're not going to sit still and watch bad things happen if we can do anything to prevent it. So, I mean, the obvious answer is, you know, are you registered to vote? Will you vote? Will you get out there and support somebody whose politics will align more closely with where you think we should go? The other thing is, it seems to me that it's important to challenge people who, for instance, we know that people who identify as white evangelical Christians, 81% of them voted for Trump in 2016.
Right.
So the question is, if we know those people, are we talking to them? Are we saying, did you get what you wanted? If not, you know, are you supporting him again? Here's why I would never vote for him, or here's what I'm doing politically. I think we have to be in conversation with difficult people. I once gave more than once, gave several talks to a mainline Republican group on the Kansas side of our state line here, called the Mainstream Coalition, that tried to challenge what you call right-wing extremists. And one of the things I said to them is that if you're not sitting down and looking them in the eye and talking to them as human being to human being, you're never going to convince them. You have to appreciate the common humanity there, and similar to Dorothy's question about how do we find the humanity in people like Limbaugh and others. We have to look them in the eye and confront them. I just don't know how else to do it. Now, you know, I still write columns for other groups. I write a blog. I can say things in public, and all of you can read that. And so that's one way that I'm able to communicate these sorts of things. But you have no matter what faith tradition you are part of, you have a prophetic voice, and you have to use that prophetic voice to shine a light on that which needs fixing, whether it's unjust systems, whether it's, Charlie, as I recall, you're in Clay County, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So Clay County has had its governmental issues, and I would be shocked to learn that you had no role in trying to fix those or trying to call attention to them up there. Because I know, I don't know you well, Charlie, but I know who you are, and I know the kind of good public servant you have been. And so it's just a matter of continuing to use your prophetic voice to challenge what's wrong out there.
Thank you.
Hello? Am I on? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Bill, I asked this very respectfully. After 9/11, I believe you traveled to try to get some answers, to understand the situation for yourself. Was that helpful to you? Can you, and if you don't wish to say, that's all right.
I know we had conversations after 9/11. Linda, remind me more specifically.
I just think you went to the Mid East to get some answers, to understand more about the background of what happened.
Yeah, right. In 2002, I took a trip to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Uzbekistan to try to understand Islam in its, not only in its current situation, but historically. We looked at when Islam was kind of at its creative zenith in terms of architecture and math and all of those things back in the 1500s, 1400s. We looked at that, and what I found was that Islam was in a battle for its soul, and that much of Islam, all of traditional Islam, was shocked and appalled at what the terrorists did in Islam's name and how they twisted the religion to be able to commit this kind of violence. And so part of my job when I came back from that, and also when I attended a number of conferences with Muslims in this country, was to help my readers understand the ways in which the hijackers and Osama bin Laden had distorted Islam and had misused it in violent ways. And so for the last 20 years almost, as a recurrent theme, I have been talking about that. And in the process, I have come to know in a personal way quite a few Muslims in the Kansas City area. Absolutely terrific people. We don't always agree on everything, and they wouldn't need me and I wouldn't need them if we did. But you know, I've come to understand some about what drives them and some about what's important to them. Like Barbara Brown Taylor, learning from other faiths, I have found things about Islam that I very much admire. The practice of 5 daily times of prayer, for instance, of the pilgrimage time to Mecca, if you can do that, charitable giving, those sorts of things, and even their memorization of the Quran, and even if they don't speak Arabic, some memorize the Quran in Arabic as a way of getting a feel for the roots of their faith. So I've come to appreciate a lot about Islam through those kinds of trips and studies and seminars, but also through individuals. And that's really important for all of us to get to know people personally, and so that they don't just look like a caricature of themselves. Does that help, Linda?
Yes, thank you very much.
Jody had her hand up before. I don't know if she's still on the line though. Jody, are you still there, Jody Deep?
Guess not.
Yes, not. Okay. I know we're approaching an hour now. Does anyone else have any final questions or comments or thoughts?
I just have a final question about how you can use the proper rhetoric to persuade a person who is bent on excluding other people, not welcoming them into the fold, with immigration, racial, with all of that. Is there any book or any place you can go to find guidance?
People tell me all the time, like, how do you know that? I said, I really don't know, but I do know that, you know, things happen for a reason. And even, let me tell you how real.
Sounded like somebody was answering that was in a different conversation.
I removed them, so.
No, that's all right. The one thing I might suggest, and maybe some of the rest of you who are on here have a better answer, but the one thing that I suggest when I run into someone who confronts me with an opinion that's different from mine, that I disagree with, and that is an exclusionary kind of opinion, I say to them, tell me your story. Tell me how you got to there. Was your family in some way excluded in a way that has helped you, that has made you feel that excluding others is the right thing to do? But to hear them out, and instead of immediately challenging them, saying, "Oh, come on, that's bunk," and to say, "No, tell me more. I want to know more. I want to know in your own personal history, what is it that has led you to a place that where you are, and then out of your own story, to begin to tell how you came to where you are." My sister Mary and I could tell, for instance, the story of our maternal grandfather, who was an immigrant from Sweden, who thought the Slavic people were bums. He wanted nothing to do with the Slavs. And, you know, we discovered, I mean, I was, you know, a teenager by the time I really understood what that meant. But to, you know, it was out of, oh, Grandpa, no, you know. But I learned out of his bigotry that was the wrong thing to do. And so out of our own personal histories, we can find ways to move forward and to challenge others. But I think it just listening to people's own stories will help you figure out why they came out where they are. If any of the rest of you has resources that would be helpful here, and David, you just disappeared, but I was thinking, or Vern, if you have a resource you want to throw out, now is the time to do that.
So in my opinion, when you're actually dealing face to face with somebody, I can't think of a better method than what Bill has suggested, which is to ask a person to tell his or her story. You don't have to read a book, you just have to listen.
Yeah. Well, Geneva, thank you for putting this together, and for all of you showing up today on a Sunday afternoon, wherever you are. Some of you are here in the Kansas City area, and others are scattered across the country, and I'm grateful for the time. I will suggest to you that if you just Google my last name, you will find my blog, and from there you can get to my other writings, and eventually when my new book comes out next year, why, maybe you'll take a look at it and buy a dozen copies a week for the rest of your life. That would be good.
Thank you so much, Bill. I'm very grateful for your time and your wisdom. And I will send a link out to everyone with your blog. And if you could email me maybe some of the books and resources you mentioned, I'm happy to share those as well. Kind of get everybody on the first step towards addressing this issue. And thank you so much to Vern for being here, and to Crest for being a co-sponsor. And are there any other final closing thoughts or concerns? No? Okay, well, thank you all so much, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon, and I hope you will continue to join us for future programs. Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.